Hi, I'm Nitya from the Modern East, and here we have Hafsa. She's the author of this book, Modesty A Fashion Paradox. So welcome, Hafsa.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So first, can we start off with telling us a bit about yourself and what is your background?
Yeah, sure. So I am a fashion and lifestyle journalist in the UAE. I've been working for a few different publications over the past decade. Most recently, I was with the national newspaper covering fashion and lifestyle with them, both on staff and freelance. And while with them, I worked a lot on stories about modest fashion for them and for other publications afterwards. So as this kind of modest fashion movement was brewing internationally, I was writing a lot about the different designers and hijabi models and new modest fashion bloggers on Instagram. So just kind of touching on all these different facets of the modest fashion movement. And then I got approached by a publisher in the UK. Her name's Neem Tree Press. It's an indie publishing house. And they said that they wanted to publish a book on modest fashion. Would I write it? So yes, of course, I said yes. It was like a dream come true. I never thought I would write a whole book on modest fashion, but here it is. Just launched in March in the UK and UAE, and it's launching in US and Canada in June.
Amazing. And so that was basically your inspiration, all the work that you've done before?
I was raised in the States up until the age of 14, and I've always had to adhere to kind of a faith-based modesty dress code, which is mainly, in my case, was covering my shoulders and covering my knees. But modest fashion also like entails covering up to your ankles and up to your wrists and sometimes your hair as well. But so for me, even just finding clothing that covered my shoulders and knees in America in the 90s was not easy to find stylish clothes that covered your skin to that level. And now it's crazy how all these mainstream retailers and e-tailers are providing this type of clothing that's also stylish and fashionable and not just like not frumpy or matronly, which is how modesty would have been perceived in fashion like 10 years ago. So I kind of was really fascinated by how modesty is now trending and why.
Why do you think modesty is trending now? Do you think it's because the spending power of this demographic, and so they're trying to cater to this demographic, or do you think it just is a trend and the look to be very exposed is just not as trendy anymore? What do you think are the reasons?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think definitely the spending power of people perceive Middle Easterners and people of Arab origin to have this kind of spending power. So designers like Tommy Hilfiger and DKNY and Mango, they've all been making Ramadan collections for the past 5 years. And it's interesting because their Ramadan collections have only been, for the most part, for the Middle Eastern audience, even though there's Muslim consumers all over the world who would be interested and like super enthusiastic about Ramadan collections from these designers. But these designers have only concentrated these collections in the Middle East. So it's definitely for spending power. They've also seen the emergence of this new hijabi fashion blogger online who like they often have like up to 1 million or more followers. There's like Asia from Kuwait and Dina Tokyo from the UK who kind of started this movement, but now there are hundreds of others. So this emergence of this new powerful modest fashion blogger has also inspired these designers and kind of raised awareness about this growing demographic that has a demand for modest fashion. And also, like you said, the trend-wise, like fashion is a very like cyclical movement. You see different trends, and we've seen like what's the norm on runways these days is to like wear clothing without a bra and like sometimes wear underwear as outerwear. And like what's the next step after that? You can't really go more exposed, more nude than that. So it's kind of just starting all over again. And I'm sure, and in I don't know how many seasons, but 2 or 3 years from now, modesty may not be on the runways anymore. It may not be a trend. Yeah.
What did you find the most challenging about writing a book?
So once I started, it was okay. It was a lot of fun for me to like write the table of contents and then just dive into it and write. For me, the most challenging part was the editing process when like I think around 10,000 words were cut out from my first draft, and that was heartbreaking. Just getting that back and seeing those lines, like pages, entire sections were just cut out, and that was super tough to deal with. So I would definitely say that was the most challenging part.
Did you have to do a lot of research to write the book, or did you feel like you already knew most of it considering your previous
Well, definitely. A lot of research. I think I spoke to over 40 women for the book, all different women, different types of consumers and entrepreneurs and designers and kind of faces of modest fashion from around the world. It helped that I had been reporting about modest fashion for a few years before this, so I kind of had those interviews to draw back on, and a lot of the quotes and stories in the book are kind of referenced from those past interviews. Like the girl on the cover of the book, Maria Idrisi, I'd actually interviewed her for the National, so I'd already spoken to her before the book. And then, but other women like hijabi model Halima Aden, and different there's this hijab designer Melanie El Turk. So all of these women I got to speak to for the book. Some in Dubai, some in Istanbul, some in London. Like there was a lot of traveling, a lot of interviewing, and a lot of.
You have a lot of pictures as well to show. Yes. Along with talking to women of today about modest fashion, you also have the history of modest fashion and how it came about. So you're kind of like combining both like traditional parts and modern into one.
Yeah, it's not just about modesty on the runways and on Instagram. It's also about why are women dressing modestly? Is it religion? Is it for feminist reasons? Is it for both? And that was actually a really tough part. Probably the toughest research aspect of the book was how the history of women's dress codes in Muslim countries such as Turkey and Egypt. And you think that like, oh, the hijab and modest dress codes were always part of these countries' like histories, but they weren't. Like in some of these countries, hijabs were even banned for a few years, depending on the different political leaders. So I found that super interesting. And like, yeah, it was tough to kind of consolidate all these little histories into like short readable summaries. But yeah, so that's actually something I learned was the different how women's dress codes have even like evolved in Muslim countries.
Do you feel like modest fashion is cultural, or is it becoming more of a global fashion standard? Like, is it only limited to the Middle East and these women that want to dress more modestly, or do you think that people that aren't even part of this demographic are kind of taking this trend on board?
Yeah, I think both. I think maybe some of its roots are culturally based, especially in places in the Middle East. But I also think in places like London, a lot of women are just dressing modestly out of their own choice, even when their mothers and grandmothers may have never like covered up in any way. So a lot of girls our age start wearing the hijab even when no one in their family has ever worn it, and it's because of their own religious research or like their own kind of way of saying like screw society's definition of beauty and standards that you have to like flaunt your body to be attractive. We want to. So yeah, that's really interesting. But also I think in the Middle East we think that modesty is ingrained here, and it is to an extent, but also a lot of women in the Middle East may not really be that invested in a modest dress code. It's just because it's in their culture, because a lot of times we see that when they travel, then they don't wear the abaya anymore, or they wear different sort of clothing. So it's really up to each different woman and how she perceives fashion and her own kind of choice.
Why do you think the topic of modest fashion is deserving of an entire book?
I think because there's so many different topics within this topic. Like there's the history of these different countries and how dressing has kind of influenced legal policy. There's politics, how it's tied to politics. I mean, look at there's some countries today that are banning hijabs and niqabs and burkinis. So there's that. There's also the interesting fact that it's not a Muslim thing at all. In religions like Christianity and Judaism, modesty is also like in the sacred texts of the Bible and the Torah. Mm-hmm. It's also interesting to see how mainstream contemporary cultural movements have shaped this like demand for modest fashion, like the Me Too movement. After the movement, a lot of women in Hollywood started kind of covering up more and wearing more demure, glamorous dresses as a reaction to that. So yeah, it's really interesting. Then there's, of course, the title of the book is Modesty A Fashion Paradox, because oftentimes you think modest and fashion, do those two even go together? Yeah. Fashion's about standing out and modesty is about maybe blending in. I'm not saying that's what modesty is about, but some people might perceive modesty to be about that, about not blending in and about not attracting attention. So it's like this conflict that's always there's like the traditionalists and the liberals, and everyone has their own views. So I try to kind of get all aspects of this debate in that chapter. Like, especially with social media, because you think, if you're being modest, are you going to be posting selfies and outfit posts every day on social media? Like, that's another kind of apparent conflict in this movement. So that's actually why my publisher was interested in this topic. She was like, how can women in hijab be walking down runways at Fashion Week? Isn't that like a contradiction? So yeah, it's one of the...
It's a lot of like the traditional sense of it and the modern world coming together. So it's a very...
Exactly, which is kind of the beautiful thing about the movement, but it's also why it's so kind of controversial between people who are so kind of entrenched in these traditional mindsets.
So what are some misconceptions about modest fashion?
Some misconceptions about modest fashion would be that it's frumpy and ugly and fashion backward rather than fashion forward. Yeah. And that modest fashion is only a limited black head-to-toe covering abayas, which obviously we know. I mean, that's kind of why we chose the cover of this, is Maria wearing a hot pink suit, like a power suit, which anyone can wear. It's empowering, it's like, it's positive, it's uplifting, it's not just an all black, you know, that image whenever you think of a modest fashion or a Muslim woman in the West, you think of that all black, only your eyes showing, the whole black, veiled, dark, depressed. Like, so that's kind of why we wanted to show the positivity and the spirit behind the movement.
It's really cool. So how much of a role have modest fashion bloggers played in putting a global spotlight on modest fashion?
They've definitely played a huge role, and a lot of designers will admit that modest fashion bloggers have inspired them with their own modest wear collections. Even there was an exhibition in San Francisco that kicked off last year. It was called the Contemporary Muslim Fashions Exhibition. Wow. And it had all of these from Nike to Dolce & Gabbana to local designers here, kind of spotlighted in this American museum. And even the curators of that museum exhibition said that modest fashion bloggers on Instagram were like, they looked to them for inspiration. So
you spoke about some of the women that you interviewed for this book. What are one or two personalities that you've interviewed in the book, and why? Some local or international ones, Middle Eastern or international ones?
So her name is Alexa, excuse the bookmark. So she's a Christian blogger. She's an apostolic Christian blogger based in Tennessee, I believe. And I met her at Dubai Modest Fashion Week last year. So I just happened to be sitting next to her. And Dubai, it was all...
Modest Fashion Week as well?
Dubai has a Modest Fashion Week, yeah.
Very cool.
So she was really interesting because I sat and interviewed her with her mother. She brought her mother along for the trip as well. And I was just talking to both of them about, like, they were at Dubai Modest Fashion Week, surrounded by Muslim and Middle Eastern women. And they had this completely different perspective of modesty. So she was saying that I don't even wear pants because in my religion doesn't recommend that women wear pants because they're a sign that's a sign of male's clothing and it's not modest for women. So she wears skirts and dresses only. So it's just so interesting to see it's a completely different perspective of modesty from a non-Middle Eastern or non-Muslim woman. But she was still like decked out in Gucci and like she was having so much fun and she was loving everything. And her mom was also like amazed by the whole spectacle. It was really interesting.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, Hafsa. And you can buy her book in the UK and UAE. Where are you selling in the UAE?
So in the UAE, it's at Kinokuniya and Magrudi's. You can buy it online, and also at bookdepository.com and amazon.ae. You can buy it online.
Do you have a Kindle version or an online version?
Not yet. In June, it will be coming out.
Okay, so everyone can get it then as well. So thank you so much, Hafsa. And I look forward to finishing off your book. It's been super interesting.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me.